This is The Countdown, discussing tomorrow's news today, as our top guests tackle the issues that matter, with a sharp take on every story. And now, here are your hosts, Andrew Weeks and Onyx Duncan.
Very good morning and welcome to another edition of The Countdown. My name is Andrew Weeks. We begin to you a special coverage here with Mr. Vincent Alexander, the chairman of Epology. He is still overseas and he's going to give us an update of what transpired at that last session there at the UN for people of African descent, and then some other matters that will come to the fore. Mr. Alexander, good morning to you, sir. It is Sunday. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Sir, we want to get your take on a few matters because there's a number of things happening, and we want to get your take on them. Yes, sir. So you came off the floor of the UN recently, just a couple of days ago, and there were a lot that was said. Give us your takeaway in terms of what you would have gathered that are of benefit to the African community in Guyana and the Caribbean in general. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, let me reference Guyana's attendance at that program. Epology was in attendance. The government of Guyana was in attendance. The Rastafarian movement was represented by Ras Kafa, and the Kimbe, the youth group of reparations, was represented by Kibwe Coatland. There were also three other persons in attendance. One ostensibly representing APAD, that's a government-sponsored organization. And there was another one representing another government-sponsored organization. And I think a third person who may also have come from APAD. Well, that was the extent of Guyana's presence at the forum. In terms of presentations, the Minister of Labour was the Guyana Minister of Labour made a presentation at the opening ceremony of the forum. I myself made two presentations, a general presentation that gave a background of things in Guyana, and a specific presentation that spoke to AI. The minister's presentation sought to see that everything was hunky-dory in Guyana. He emphasized Guyana's support for reparations, and he quoted a number of projects, programs in Guyana, such as GOAL, the housing project, as the basis to show that African Guyanese were in no worse position than any other Guyanese, and therefore there was no need for quote-unquote special attention, so to speak, since the general attention suffices for the need of African Guyanese. The other speakers, other than Epology, sought to buttress what the minister would have said. So there were clearly organizations that were working in tandem with the government and sought to repeat the same things, in a sense, that the minister said. What was of interest is one of them also sought to lambaste David Hines for what he has been saying in Guyana, so that that person took a swipe at David Hines. The ERC was also represented by its chairperson, Mr. Hack, and there again he sought to indicate that what the DRC was doing was what's required, creating harmony and unity, and that there were no problems to be resolved. The second of those speakers, whilst commending what was happening in Guyana, said that there were outstanding matters to be addressed. And he came from, I think, something referred to as the African Association. And so that was the tenure of those persons. I myself spoke to the current state of things in Guyana. And I spoke to that against a particular background. The background of the goals for the International Decade of African Descent, which has now been extended to a second decade. Goals which talk about recognition, justice, and development in the people of African descent, and more specifically talked about the need for institutional and legal framework changes to overcome the remnants of slavery and colonization that still affect the people of Guyana, in addition to the need for equity, if those frameworks are changed, to ensure the people of African descent can catch up with others. And that was the background against which I spoke. And I talked to the problem that African people are confronted with. For example, I talked about the land problem, the best evidence of which is what has occurred in Mocha Arcadia, where clearly, in the context of ancestral land, those people were inhabiting ancestral lands, and they were bulldozed off of those lands under the pretext the road was going to pass there, and we all know that the road has not passed there. They were also bulldozed after the president, when he was a minister responsible for housing, had encouraged those people to improve on their housing on those said lands. And he himself, when he became president, had gone to Mocha Arcadia and told those people that the value of their homesteads would go up because of the road that would pass adjacent. And lo and behold, notwithstanding all of that, they were bulldozed from those lands. So I emphasize lands as one of the issues of concern. I also emphasize the whole question of marginalization in terms of contracts, the question of inclusion in terms of the government specifically bypassing local authorities and others, as should be others who should be involved in decision making as prescribed for in the Constitution. And so basically, I spoke to the state of African Ghanaians and confronted what Minister Hamilton would have said. Because what Minister Hamilton said really represents two things. It represents the fact that the government has been supportive of reparations, but it needs to be understood that the reparations which the government supports are external representations of the former colonizers, or the former plantation owners, and compensate the people of African descent for what they did to them during slavery and during the colonial period. It does not speak to reparations that are internal. And the word reparations itself means repair. And what the forum emphasized, and I emphasized, was that there is need for internal repair in response to the remnants of slavery, colonization, and even post-independence as a form of reparations. Our government does not speak to that, and in fact suggests that there's no need to speak to that since there are no remnants. So all is hunky-dory with the people of African descent in Guyana. And that is where we have a point of significant departure. The people need to understand that yes, there is gold, and it's a shameful thing for us to talk about gold publicly anyhow. Yes, there is housing. But the decade does not speak to the normal regime. It speaks for a regime that's responsive to things that have historically affected the people of African descent. And we have been historically affected by the way in which our ancestral lands have been treated. It started with our ancestral lands being flooded. Those ancestral lands then came under the control of local authorities, and local authorities, in cahoots with the government, have been allocating those lands away from the original owners. And that's an institutional and legal arrangement that needs to be remedied. Our government is not talking about it. They're saying that they give people housing. Yes, they give people housing, but they have not remedied the historical wrongs that are still affecting the people of African descent. They're not talking about an education system that seeks to introduce the teaching of Guyanese history with emphasis on the role of the people of African descent to Guyanese history. And that's important. People of African descent are going to be able to realize their own self-recognition and to be recognized by others. The decade is about recognition. So we have a number of issues which have not been addressed, be they land issues, be they education issues, be they contract issues, be they security issues, in the realms of institutions and laws that have been held over and are disadvantageous to the people of African descent. And our government, though they signed on to the decade, they have done nothing specific in response. And I can't overemphasize this, because going about talking about gold and all of those things is not a specific response to the state of the people of African descent. On the contrary, they have done things to perpetuate the ills. So, for example, when the president spoke with Paul Slough as chairman of the Police Service Commission and sought to have him discriminate in terms of promotions, giving advantage to Indo-Guyanese who may not have merited promotion. And similarly, when they spoke to Calvin Brutus, instructing him to be discriminatory in the promotions, here are instances where not only are we seeing remnants of slavery and remnants of colonization, we see a continuation, a perpetration, and a perpetuity of things that affect the people of African descent. Certainly, discriminating in terms of employment, and with a specific example that affect people of African descent. If we are to fix our institutions in a manner that does not allow for that kind of interference, then we'll be protecting the interests of the people of African descent. For example, the question of prescriptive rights, land acquisition. The government passed a law ensuring that you cannot acquire by prescriptive rights state land. Those state land belong to all of us. But you can't acquire those lands by occupation. But you can still acquire lands owned by the people of African descent by prescriptive rights. The government has done nothing to protect the people of African descent, who are the ones mostly affected by prescriptive rights in terms of their lands. So clearly, no matter how many buildings you put up, no matter how many roads you build, if you do not have institutional arrangements that give the people of African descent a protection of their rights, and we don't put in place equitable consideration so they can overcome the disadvantages, historical disadvantages, then we are still in the same place in comparative and relative terms. So it doesn't matter what Nandelad says about how many more of this or how many more of that the people of African descent got. How much more of this and or that have we gotten in comparison to others? Contracts being an example. You can identify people of African descent who have gotten the big contracts, and in fact, all of the big contracts are evidently held by a few persons. If you have institutional change that goes into affirmative action, which would be institutional change and some level of equity, you would see a change in that. So it doesn't matter that some people have now gotten contracts. In comparative terms, the system still does not grant the people of African descent rights that belong to them. Don't tell me that 60 Guyanese who are involved in some African Guyanese association of entrepreneurs got land. And to say that that is correcting the problem, that is not correcting the problem. Correction of the problem would mean that individual people of African descent can, in the normal course of things, acquire land. And that 60 can acquire land as a cooperative. Having these 60 people come together to form an association of entrepreneurship for the people of African descent, and having them have to negotiate for lands, suggests that things are not correct. That is not the normal rule of law arrangement. For them have to go and bargain with Jagdio. A Guyanese should be able to make an application for lands and to get lands and not have to form an ethnic association and then to go and bargain with Jagdio and to be used as optics by the PPP to say, look, African people are getting something. They should be able to get things in a normal course. And so the forum continued with all of the hundreds of contributions to call for recognition, justice, and development, to call for institutional changes in the countries that are affected, to call for legal changes, and all of the presentations spoke to that. The need for special attention to the people of African descent in terms of how you fashion national institutions that creates an environment in which they can enjoy equal rights. That's what the forum spoke to. How do you fashion laws that seek to ensure that you don't have discrimination? How do you deal, for example, with a police force that was formed historically as an arm of suppression and that still is oppressive? Still oppressive, still in having standing orders and cultural habits demonstrated only recently in Linden. How do you ensure that those things no longer occur? That the people of African descent can, for example, be involved in peaceful protests without being shot at, and it seems to be not only shot at, but murdered in the course of being shot at. Those are the changes that we are talking about. And the government does not pay attention to those. They suggest that those are not issues that affect us, but the entire forum called for those matters to be addressed wherever they're evident, and they are evident in Ghana. On the specific question of the ERC, we took to the forum our complaint that the ERC is made up of representatives of different groups. In the case of people of African descent, there was an election process to determine our representative on the ERC. Here, the ERC is going to a forum that is specifically addressing issues affecting the people of African descent. And the African representative is not considered fit to attend that forum, but someone else who might be a good Guyanese, but who doesn't have the African Guyanese experience on one hand, and who has not been identified by the African Guyanese to represent them on the other hand, is the person who turns up to speak at a forum about the International Decade for People of African Descent and the state of those people, because the forum sought to have a report as to what was done in the first decade and to speak to what ought to be done in the second decade. And the Ghana delegation, be it the ERC or the government, and those surrogate organizations, none of them could speak specifically, and I emphasize that, as to what was done for the people of African descent, given where they are at in the social and economic ladder. Nor could they speak to what is intended to be done. And so we spoke to what has not been done and what we think should be done. And in that regard, we made the point that there's a need for the government to have disaggregated data by ethnicity so that that data can be used for policy formulation. That data will tell them what's the status of the different ethnic groups, all the ethnic groups, and then they can formulate policy to address the issues that confront the ethnic groups. And here we are speaking about the people of African descent in particular. So when we spoke on the AI, what we call for is data-driven policy. Data-driven policy. And we said that if the government did not have proper data, then we can have situations where AI is used to skew and misrepresent realities that can then be the basis for decision making, which will then negatively impact the people of African descent. So we are calling for the government to have data-driven decisions. So, for example, we have an outstanding census. It's outstanding now for almost 3 years. That should be used to drive decision making. We don't know what the numbers are, but they're making policies to run the country. And we are saying that not only should we have the numbers, it should be disaggregated. So we should know how many poor people they got and which ethnic groups they are residing in. How many contracts are given out and which ethnic groups are the beneficiaries. What's the level of poverty and all of those things. Now, here is a great opportunity for the government to use data to do one of two things. To show that what they're saying is correct, or to admit our realities and to formulate policies to address our realities. So I compliment the Attorney General about his own recent contention that if a certain kind of audit was done, it would show what they are saying. I compliment him in this regard. You know what instrument can be used. You have exhibited that knowledge. Now use the instrument and stop the propaganda. Because in similar manner, the same Attorney General collected documents from GCOM and told this nation that he was going to use those documents to show that the APNU AFC was getting involved in fraudulent electoral activities. The APNU AFC brought forward those documents to show that they were fraudulent electoral activities. He is saying that the submission of the documents is fraudulent. They are saying the document shows the fraudulence during elections. He has the documents that can be easily checked against our immigration records, and on that basis can tell the true story. Because the accusation is that there are people who voted at the last elections who were not in the country. And there has been verification of that, though a very small proportion of the documents were verified. by the chief immigration officer, as the law allows him to do under the National Registration Act, and more particularly Registration Regulation 44. They can prove the AP and UAFC being fraudulent if those documents are what they say they are. But they haven't taken the opportunity. In fact, he's gone definitely silent, definite silence over 2 years about those documents. And so, whilst he goes out there touting what an audit can show, I'm challenging him that to carry the audit and to bring forward the other documents and have those verified so we can know the true status of the people of African descent. But in the meanwhile, if Padaji has conducted surveys, and those surveys point to the need for the issues affecting people of African descent to be addressed. We conducted an enumeration when they had the flood and were able to give to Minister Mustafa the names of 4,000 persons who had been bypassed when they were doing their enumeration for flood relief. 4,000 persons. We have done another survey that speaks to the needs of the people of African descent. And that survey, we haven't been able to complete that work because they stopped our funding and the enumerators were not paid. But they tell people that the money is not meeting the people of African descent. To do an enumeration like that and to come forward has significant impact on the people of African descent. And we've recently done a survey among our membership, again speaking to the state of the people of African descent. And that survey speaks to the issues with contracts, the issues with employment, the issues with security, all coming from the voices of the people of African descent through their organizations, although the government would contend that the Padaji does not have any interest in the people of African descent. We have done the work. We've got the stats. We've asked the government to have a conversation. And the government has refused us that conversation, notwithstanding a request written twice, oral 4 times. And they haven't had a conversation with us. And somebody says to me, well, they're not going to have a conversation with y'all because they believe that y'all are surrogates of the People's National Congress reform. But the fact of the matter is, they should even have a conversation with the PNC because they represent officially some 49% of the population. And we know that they refuse to have conversations with them as well in various forms, conversations through the elected representatives of the local democratic organs. But here is the propaganda out there suggesting that we do not look after the interests of the people of African descent. We empathize with our people. We empathize with them because, like them, we know what they don't get. And we empathize with them when they find ways and means of getting some of the ways and means which compromise them. And so we empathize with Bond for finding a way and mean of putting himself in a position where the court matter that was brought against him may well be dropped. May well be dropped. And so we understand. And we, in this instance, sympathize, but cannot agree that that's the way in which the people of African descent should conduct their business. To go hunky-dory to the government, selling their souls to get what they can't otherwise get, or to be relieved of guilt, which otherwise would be imposed upon them. The forum at the end called for the disaggregation of data and for data-driven the policy making. I would say that's one of the major outcomes of the forum, a very, very concrete matter for states to get involved in disaggregating data on, along ethnic lines, and for them to use the data for policy formulation. The forum also had a segment where they dealt specifically with the question of Haiti, specifically with the question.
Yes.
In that regard, the forum expressed concern about the manner in which Haitians are treated by a number of countries, and they specified even in some presentations the manner in which Haitians are treated in the CARICOM. And it came out clearly that the only people who are discriminated against in CARICOM and not allowed the freedom of movement that the CARICOM Charter caters for are the Haitians. And we know the problems that we've had where our government has imposed visa requirements for Haitians coming to Ghana, although them being a member of CARICOM and CARICOM providing for freedom of movement, our government has withdrawn that what may be well referred to as an entitlement of Haitians as citizens of CARICOM. So the forum called for us to deal with the problem of CARICOM and specifically mention the discriminatory manner in which Haitians are treated in terms of their movement in CARICOM countries.
Thank you so much, Mr. Alexander. I want to jump back a little bit more on the UN forum to get some more clarity and on what transpired. You, in your first presentation, you asked for the UN body to support the Africans in Ghana for justice. Because as you know, what's happening here. Have you been speaking to other countries in terms of highlighting some of the problems that we are facing here in Guyana under this government? And have you gotten any advice, any counsel, any support for those advices?
Undoubtedly, we spoke to other countries. First of all, in the forum itself, where there were approximately 800 different bodies represented. So that's where the conversation started in the forum. We've also had the opportunity to speak to specific organizations in specific countries and expressing our views and them expressing their sympathy, a sympathy which was further expressed in the forum itself when they called for specific actions to be taken. Of course, in the forum itself, when they called, they didn't mention specifically Guyana, but the things that they called for are applicable to Guyana. We've also had conversations with organizations that have agreed that we will have ongoing relationship so that we can continue to keep them abreast of what's happening in Guyana as much as they keep us abreast of what's happening in their countries. And they can then be a voice. Because what happens with this forum is that there's a report coming out of the forum. A preliminary report was given on Thursday, but that's not the final report. And that report goes to the Human Rights Council because the decade operates under the Human Rights Council. And so that report will go to the Human Rights Council. And the Human Rights Council will then confront Guyana through their universal periodic review. Many Guyanese would remember just over a year ago that the government of Guyana was publicly called upon to answer and give stewardship for human rights in Guyana. And this forum is a part of that process of determining what progress has been made, and therefore the way in which the UN will now reach out in its processes to Guyana, asking them to account for what has happened since the last forum and since the last Universal Periodic Review. So we are looking forward to the periodic review, which will come up in May next month, to see what the UN puts before Guyana in terms of their non-fulfillment or the fulfillment of their obligations and their pledges and commitments. We are also looking forward to the UN Human Rights Council putting in place certain mechanisms, because one of the things that have been called for is that the UN should now work with its sister agencies in terms of providing support, financial and other forms of support to NGOs and to countries in pursuits of the goal of the decade. So the UN will, at the level of the Human Rights Council, report to the UN at large in their policy making in relation to matters that affect the people of African descent. It's a report like that that has led, in fact, to the declaration of a second decade. It is felt, given the reports, that the first decade had not achieved what was required, and therefore a second decade has now been declared. And the hope is that we all will have learned from our experiences of the first decade and make the second decade more meaningful. And we all means also the states, like the government of Guyana, which had no specific proprietary internal program, no specific program in relation to the decade and the state of African people, they will now have such a program.
That's well said. Just for the record, Mr. Alexander, would you tell the viewing public, as your body who represents a large amount of African grouping in the country, has the government really come out and reconsider or decided to say we're going to, give you back the funds that you need to help African efforts and African programs in the country? For the record, has the government reached out to you to give you back those funding for EPADG?
Two things. The government has refused to even have a conversation with us. As citizens of this country, representing 78 organizations across Guyana, 78 organizations located in 7 regions, they have refused to have a conversation. Early in the day, when they sought to point their fingers at us, we were summoned to the Ministry of Culture, Youth and Sport by the minister. We humbly went to that meeting. The minister who called us to the meeting with himself did not himself come to the meeting. He sent his PS with 3 questions, which we answered. At that meeting, we said to the PS, please indicate to the minister that we still have a desire to meet with him. That has never happened. We have made a request 4 times to the president orally and 2 times in writing to meet with him. He has promised us 5 times out of the 6 to meet. That has not happened. I say that to say that they have not even agreed to meet, much less to consider returning the funds to us. They have continued in recent time again to suggest using all sorts of surrogates, including Roel Johnson, that we did not properly expend the funds. The fact of the matter is that we didn't just simply get funds. We got funds after making submissions to the government, and those submissions would have indicated our budget lines. They gave us the money, and then come afterwards to say we haven't spent the money the way it should have been spent, when in fact they gave us based on the budget lines which we submitted, and their investigative audit showed that we had not departed from the manner in which the money was intended based on the way in which the budget was configured. So we have a very devious and hypocritical situation where on one hand, the decade is not intended to merely, if at all, give funds to people for projects. That does not bring about institutional and legal changes. That's what the decade is focused on. So, on one hand, they're claiming that we haven't done what was required of the decade, which is not true, because the decade is very specific about what was required. On the other hand, even in the instance where we gave out some funds, there's a tremendous lie and distortion. We gave out 10 million, which was specially given for grants. We gave out 10 million. And of the 10 million, 300 and something thousand was a residual sum that we gave out in 2020. And JAGDEO used our records, which we made available. We have nothing to hide. Use our records. Looked at the 300 something thousand in 2020 and said, this is all that they give out in terms of grants. When in fact, it was a residual sum of 10 million. These people are shameless. And one may well contend that it is not just a matter of not understanding what the decade is about. It's a matter of not being committed. It's a matter of being discriminatory. It's a matter that may well fall within the ambit of racist behavior when you see what they have done. And the matter of the funds, they have not said a single word to us. The matter went to court. 2 years have elapsed and we can't get a judgment. As we look and see other cases being dealt with in door time, other cases, our case was completely heard. And after 2 years, we can't get a judgment. The decade in which it was heard and for which it was heard has expired and we can't get a judgment. The matter wasn't considered sufficiently urgent and important to be put on the front burner of judgments. Other things have been on the front burner of judgments, things that are related not to the community at large, but to individuals. Things related to individuals have been put in the front burner. And our case, we don't know why. We don't know why. And we don't have the reach into the judicial system, nor the intent to interfere into the judicial system to go finding out what has happened.
Right.
So no, they haven't spoken to us about funds. What they said initially is that they were going to give these funds to the individual African Guyanese organizations.
And not the
And in 2020, and not the PADG. In 2023, they did give monies to individual African Guyanese organizations. And we had no problem with those organizations getting monies. We didn't concede that those were the funds that should come to us. Give them funds. You have funds, give them. That doesn't affect the PADG. We observed, however, that the funds were given and the systems for accountability, which were virtually non-existent. We're not pointing fingers at the organizations. We're pointing fingers at the government. They gave organizations funds, and all the organizations were required to do was at the end of the projects to write a report saying the project has been completed. The PADG doesn't act that way. In whatever the PADG has done, we have mechanisms to ensure that what is committed to be done is in fact done, because we want to be an organization that operates in keeping with good governance. But they gave these guys money, and we don't have a problem with that, for projects, and we're not accusing the organizations of anything, but we're just saying that the system they implemented left it wide open for the funds not to be properly managed. That was in 2023. In 2024, they gave them no money.
Wow.
So in 2024, that facade was removed, that they have an interest. They gave them nothing in 2024. And I know not of an allegation of an allocation in the bottom of 2025 to be given to them. What they got in 2024 was the normal monies that organizations would get for emancipation. And that has been done for decades now, so that's not a special attention to anyone. The special attention that apparently was given in 2023 was not repeated, and that special attention prior would have been what we got in 2022, up to 2022. But no, they haven't showed that they are about to specifically address the African organizations in terms of funding. But we maintain that that is not the crux of the matter. Funding. Funding will be meaningful when we have the institutional arrangements in this country so that an African Guyanese organization getting involved in something and get involved in something that would be enhanced and protected by legal institutional arrangements which are presently not in place.
A lot to say. Mr. Alexander, thank you very much for that part. We have like about 5 or 10 minutes more to go. We want to thank you for those updates from the UN perspective, from the African Guyanese perspective, from a Caribbean perspective as a whole. I want to jump a little bit more to election matters now. You have seen, different parties are coming up, different groups are coming out. You have seen up to today that the Elections Commission has not taken up those recommendations that were given during the 2020 elections from the observers. They have not, implement any of those in any big way. Maybe a few, but not to that extent to make changes to the electoral body. Do you think that Guyanese could say that they have full confidence in GCOM to conduct a fair and impartial election in this year?
Let me answer that question this way. Guyanese have said that they don't have confidence. So it's not a matter of my opinion. Guyanese have said they don't have confidence. And as a commissioner of GCOM, knowledgeable of the operations of GCOM, I can support the contention of those Guyanese that they should not have confidence. How can you have confidence in an institution which in the first instance refuses to conduct a simple review of its operations to determine if there are things to be strengthened and or corrected? And they refuse to conduct this review when being called upon to do so, internally by commissioners and externally by stakeholders. We have had 2020 elections with all sorts of accusations. All sorts of accusations. And the commission has refused. So it's okay for them to have Mingo and the others charged and locked up. But it's not okay for them to ask themselves, what may have gone wrong? How can we correct and rectify what may have gone wrong? We know on the East Coast that approximately 14,000 votes are affected by the absence of accountability. The documentation can be found to give authenticity and validity to those ballots, but they were counted. 14,000. In an election where the government is a one-seat majority. A one-seat majority. We in GCOM have long now determined that manual fingerprints are not the most effective way of dealing with the determination of duplicates. We, GCOM, and I challenge them to say otherwise, have information, concrete information which says that because we do our fingerprints manually, they cannot all be cross-matched. And because they cannot all be cross-matched, they are duplicates which turn up on our voters' roll. That is fact. That is fact. Yet, GCOM refuses to embrace digital capture of fingerprints to overcome a known problem. Refuses. And they come down to the point where they use time. They don't have enough time. And these issues are not new issues. They are old issues. They are old issues. The issue of the inefficacy of fingerprints was determined before the 2020 elections. The need to do digital capture of fingerprints was determined before, when the administration actually presented budgeted figures for us to acquire equipment for the digital capture of fingerprints. And today, GCOM refuses to embrace that. And when I say GCOM, the public audience should understand that they use this word GCOM. And therefore, people ask me, what you all are doing at GCOM? Well, when they say GCOM, more than often, it's a 3-4 situation where 3 commissioners take a position and the chairman joins with them. And that's what the GCOM is that they're talking about. So there's no consensus on these matters in GCOM. How can you have confidence in a GCOM where the legal officer is contending that all that he said in the case had been brought to the attention of the chairperson specifically, had been discussed, had been circulated to the commissioners, and I am a commissioner who was in receipt of those documents. No commissioner sent back any objection, and now they're claiming that he didn't carry the instructions of the CEO. That's the claim. How could you have confidence in a body that does that? Blatantly lies on an officer and terminates, does not renew his contract because he's not in the same drive with the government. He's not in the same drive with the government, because the drive with the government was seen in court when they argued that you have regional democratic councils, and the law, Article 73, specifies that residents should vote for those councils. And they argue that there's no need to verify who those residents are. That once somebody give an address, it doesn't matter where they really live, then the person is entitled to vote in those regional elections. That is what this government has embraced in the face of a constitution that talks about representativeness. They are setting up a system where the councillors, on one hand, may not be representative, and on the other hand, where the people who elect the representatives are not the people entitled to do so. The whole system is corrupted. The whole system is corrupted. There's no reason to have confidence in GCOM based on their past performance, as they have articulated it, and based on the present conduct of electoral matters.
But Mr. Alexander, in terms of recommendation, on your point, from your personal standpoint, would you give us a few reforms that would put GCOM in a position to say the public will certainly have confidence in them if these steps, 1, 2, 3 steps or 4 steps are taken, where other countries like America and England, they trust the system. Why is the system cannot be trusted?
If they do digital capture fingerprints, then we will eliminate the duplicates that turn up on our electoral roll. If they allow for digital identification at the place of poll, they'll eliminate the accusations that came forward that people who did not turn up in person were voted for. 2 cases straight off the bat. There are recommendations also in relation to addressing the question of the thousands, if not tens of thousands, of overseas Guyanese, many of whom are known to be dead, who are still on the voters list. Action is required for that to be taken as well. We've had recent discussions on the question of granting the polling agents for political parties the right to have a certificate of employment so they can vote at the place where they're working. That is being turned down. It means that although this government and people in GCOM talk about enfranchisement, we have put in place a system that disenfranchises a person who's working for a political party because that person will be working in a place other than where he's entitled to vote, and you cannot use a certificate of employment to vote. You have to leave the place of poll and leave it open for malpractices to take place and go and vote somewhere else. That recommendation has been turned down of using certificates of employment to protect the vote of political workers, the way in which the vote of GCOM workers are protected. Yet there is this big thing about enfranchisement, and nobody should be affected by any mechanisms that don't allow them to vote. I have raised the question of why in Guyana, when the court, the government, the chief elections officer, the chairman of GCOM, they're all touting the right of everyone to cast a vote once they reach the age of 18 and they're a citizen of Guyana. That's their bottom line. Yet, people who are incarcerated, and more particularly people who are remanded, are not considered as being 18 plus or being citizens. They are not currently allowed to vote. I have put that on the agenda. But what has been happening recently, we have been postponing meetings and issues that are to be resolved and not being resolved. And like biometrics, we probably soon hear that we don't have time to resolve them, that we have an election to run, and that those of us who are raising these issues are raising them to postpone and the running of the elections. That's what the argument will be. But we are having postponement of meetings where things could be discussed. They're not being discussed, and the clock is ticking.
The clock is ticking. Mr. Alexander, thank you very much. I don't know if you have any final, question that you want to, or statement you want to make before we go, but I get your point that you are saying that the electoral body is corrupted. I got that. It is corrupted. It cannot be trusted. And so we're in a dilemma. We're in a serious situation here in the country. Political parties are in serious problems in some of the confidence for these elections. How would you advise them?
I, as a commissioner, will not be advising political parties. I will be making available to the nation at large, including political parties, the factual information. That's what I will be doing. As a commissioner, I see it as my role. I don't see my role as specifically advising a political party. I'm not a commissioner of a party. I'm a commissioner with a constitutional office with an obligation to the people of Guyana. And so my advice would be for the political parties to allow themselves access to the information that we make available, and on the basis of that information, they can make decisions as to how they will deal with this corrupted system as it edges its way towards an election.
Before you go, Vincent, I haven't heard your thoughts on the Commissioner of Information that should have been given information to the public and has refused to give those information. I haven't gotten your thoughts on that. What are your thoughts on that office?
They're no different from the thoughts in the public domain. My own disposition is that much of government's business is business of the public and should not be withheld from the public. Much of government's business. There may be issues that deal with military matters, security matters that may not be wise to have in the public domain. But that apart, you conducted business on behalf of people. The question of accountability is not about adding up numbers. That's a part. The question of accountability is being accountant to the people who put you there for the actions that you take. And therefore you need to explain to them what you have done, why you have done it. And they can only pose questions if they have information. You're entitled to that. And here's a commissioner. I don't know that he has responded to any one request for information positively. And being paid, has a budget of millions of dollars per year.
Million, so to say.
Per year. And not doing the job that is intended. But this has to do with another aspect. We have to find a way in which people who are given jobs are professional people who are not political lackeys. You take somebody who is a former candidate and you give that person information, a job to give out information, which you don't want to give out. And then you turn around and tell people, you're not talking to Padiji because they might be close to the PNC. So the PNC people have no right of association, have no right to employment. But your people have right to everything, including occupying offices that you compromise because you're occupying them politically.
All right, Mr. Alexander, thank you very much for being on the program this morning. I wish you all the best and congratulations to your team from the UN. You did a great job. The public was watching, they were looking, they were listening. And I know for sure that we have plenty more opportunities to the UN to get your representation at the UN again on matters of African concern, African matters. And so I want to congratulate you and your team, and on behalf of all of us here on the Countdown, we want to congratulate you and to wish you all the best as you continue to fight for the rights of Guyanese. Mr. Alexander, thank you very much and have a good afternoon.
To continue.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. All right.